Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Passionately Wrong podcast with James and myself, Randy. Today we have a really great guest, Steve. He's going to introduce himself in a minute, but this goes back to I invited him on here because I did the Camino de Santiago. We've talked about this in a previous episode and what it meant to me to walk through the plains of Spain for a month. And Steve runs a nonprofit that helps veterans get on the Camino and heal. And so we're going to get into that. But first, Steve, welcome. And can you please just talk about your history? You had a couple of different services in the military, and then you went on to do better things.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Glad to be on this morning. And so I'm Father Steve Rindahl, retired U.S. Army Chaplain, retired in 2016, which I like to say was my second career within one career, in that I retired from the Army, but I spent a little bit over the first half on the enlisted side. I started out as a parachute rigger, packing, repairing, maintaining parachutes in an assignment with the Special Forces, then got picked up on recruiting duty, which ultimately motivated me to get out of the Army, but with no idea what I was going to do next. And after really not knowing what to do, I like to say it was what God was using to shake me around a little bit and get my attention. Then I investigated what it would take to enter into ministry, determined to call to ministry, discerned to call to ministry. And with the idea of returning to the Army as a chaplain, I was actually motivated in that by a chaplain that I had when I was enlisted, by the name of Chaplain Peterson, one of the very few long tab chaplains in the Army, Special Forces qualified chaplain. And he had started out on the enlisted side, gotten out, realized that his life would improve if he included God in the process, and then went through the process of becoming a minister, and then thought to himself, I should have known this when I was in the Army. So he returned to the Army as a chaplain. And so he motivated me, and likely doesn't know it because I haven't seen him since, really provided me a guidepost to keep myself oriented by. Finished out another, that would have been 14 additional years at that point, serving as a chaplain, served with the 1st Cavalry Division, deployed with them, went to Iraq from October of 2006 to January of 2008. So that was a 15-month deployment. And for those that are quick on their calendar, you realize that ruined 2 Thanksgivings and 2 Christmases with a single deployment. Came home from that and was assigned to the Army's Medical Command, and where I had the opportunity to do a specialization in PTSD care, which really informed a lot of my work after that. I did my doctorate in trauma care, moved from there to the 10th Mountain Division Light Infantry up in New York, and spent a couple of years there, and then ultimately got selected by the Army to go and teach at the Army Medical Center and School in San Antonio, where I taught for a couple of years and finished my career with a grand total of 31 years of service. And when I was teaching there at AMED, when I was teaching there at AMED Center and School, I taught how to provide a ministerial response to combat trauma, and what was then almost a brand new and still relatively young field of study called moral injury, which is that, to give a kind of simple definition of it, that sense of angst, that sense of dis-ease with your experiences in combat, whether they be something personally done, something witnessed, something done to you.
Yeah, for those who don't know, if those listening who are military, I don't know many people who went to combat who didn't come out with some kind of moral injury. I didn't even understand what it was myself till I was getting out and going through the psychologist's kind of analysis on my way out, and they were talking about this too. It's just, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's the feeling that you could have done something more. You're responsible for things that maybe were totally out of your control, but you felt like you could have changed the past in some way. For me, that's the way it framed itself. And for other people, it might be a little bit differently.
Yeah. And the outcomes, how it manifests in the person, will vary greatly from one to the next. You have people who want to return to a combat role in order to, quote, get it right this time. to people who no longer trust their own decision-making processes. It just runs the gamut of ways that interfere with a person's just normal daily living. So left can be quite debilitating.
Especially for military leaders, which is where it shows a lot too, unfortunately. Yeah. I don't, James, you got any questions? I'm really curious about the ministry serving the moral injury and the PTSD, how that looks different than the medical field or the psychologist field, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's definitely
Right.
worth spending some time on that topic because I guess there's a lot of different ways that the military in particular has tried to figure out how to be effectively treat people with PTSD or moral injury. And you've probably seen a lot in your time about different approaches. Yeah, that's probably a fruitful area. Is it religious? Is it behavioral? Is it psychology? Is it medication? Is it a combination of things? And maybe you probably gave us a hint when you said that people themselves respond very differently to the circumstances they're in. They probably also respond differently to different forms of care and treatment. But what's been your experience at the types of things that have been effective when you're dealing with people who are suffering?
Thank you for asking. I'll say this to start first, and I just picked up on this intuitively before I actually started studying the topic, is that people ought to be given, because people do respond differently, the opportunity to gain support from any resource that can provide them support. And so from my very first assignment as a chaplain in the 1-5 Cav, 1st Cavalry, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. At the battalion level, you don't have behavioral health support directly, but I partnered really closely with our physician assistant, who was the battalion doc, Doc Stulls, Dean Stulls, great guy. And he had all the behavioral health connections. And so a person would come in to me and they'd have something that I could give an answer to from a position of faith. And when I say that, I represent Christianity. Obviously, I'm a priest, but the reality is almost, I'm not going to say 100%, but almost across the spectrum, the ways of expressing faith that are in the world have some sort of message about God-giving mercy, God-giving grace. And so a person who's beset with some sort of guilt, whether it's well-placed or completely incorrectly placed, if you're dealing with guilt, having a message of mercy and grace is an important thing. At the opposite end of the spectrum, a person who legitimately went through something that was traumatic and created a fear response, which we see in PTSD a lot, and now as a result, they are having a fear response that was legitimate at the point of cause, but now everything that's even remotely similar is creating that startle and that fear response. That's a behavioral health issue, right? And so that's going to be best addressed by people who have the treatment modalities that address irregular behavior. No matter how normal and understandable the source of the problem is, the behavior has become irrational in the context of just living in a civilian world back at home. And so I've always made a big effort to partner with my medical professional colleagues and behavioral health colleagues. And then moving it into the brigade level leadership, which I did towards the end of my career, once I started teaching, and then now specifically in our nonprofit, Warriors on the Way, which is the pilgrimage program for combat veterans, we don't run a pilgrimage without having a behavioral health doc on the team. So I go as representative of God, what God can do for you, what spirituality can do for you, what faith can do for you. And either Dr. Landry or Dr. Phillips or Dr. John Meyer, who's joined our team this year, one of those three will be on the trip to answer those behavioral health questions, and we make a point. We we literally stand shoulder to shoulder and say, we are two sides of the same healing coin. What you need is dependent on what you're experiencing, but we're both here for you. And one of us may be more important to your particular need and the other play a supporting role or vice versa, but we're both here for you so you can get the full spectrum of care. So I want to point that out really strongly, because the sad truth is there are people of faith, people who are in vocational ministry that don't trust behavioral health professionals. And there are behavioral health professionals that don't trust people of faith. And as a result, whoever it is they're serving is getting less care than they ought to be getting, or that they deserve to be getting. And so the partnership between myself and whichever behavioral health specialist is working with me is of the utmost importance. And so in that explanation, I gave away the answer in that things that are moral injury, right? Moral injury is thumbnail defined as guilt. It may or may not be guilt as we typically know it, but that guilt, that angst, that just feeling of something's not right are really well addressed from the perspective of spirituality, from this perspective of you are loved, you can be forgiven, you can overcome this just through grace and mercy. And then the opposite, those that are more classically aligned under the umbrella of PTSD, those startle responses, the things that are fear and shock related, and those are now impacting how you react to the various physical stimuli, visual things that you send, things that you hear. Those are really best addressed by behavioral health. The question comes in that both of them have a lot of overlapping symptoms. If you look at the Venn diagram, the two circles overlap, there's a giant section in the center of intrusive thoughts, dreams, self-medication, all these things. It's actually one of the things that interfered with the treatment of moral injury when it was first identified, because those in the behavioral health field, following the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual by which you make diagnoses, has a person come in, they start rattling off all these symptoms. They're like, oh yeah, this is classic PTSD. And they start treating them for PTSD. And some would get better and some would get worse. And the question is, why are some people getting worse? And the people who are getting worse are the people who are feeling guilt. The people who are starting to feel better are the people who were having the various fear responses. But it was disguised by the fact that the symptoms are the same. So it was totally understandable and natural for them to look and say, oh, these symptoms match PTSD, you have PTSD. And it wasn't until the writings of a guy by the name of Shea that moral injury was identified as something unique. And then Shea, another doctor by the name of Dewey, another guy at the VA by the name of Tick, and most recently, Britt, can't think of his last name, but they started realizing that there's a unique group off to the side that it's PTSD symptoms, but it's not PTSD, which put moral injury on the table for discussion. And within the Army context, or within the DoD context, the Chaplain Corps has led the effort in wait a minute, if these are all related to how you feel about the circumstance, and did I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing, or did I fail to stop the wrong thing from happening, and all the different ways it can spin out, then those are answers that chaplains are uniquely positioned to answer better, more effectively than on the behavioral health side. Brett Litz, that's his last name, Litz. And Litz even acknowledges that in the early VA work is that they simply didn't know how to answer questions of guilt. And a lot of the therapists, when hearing service members discuss what was creating that sense of guilt, were personally repulsed. It's easy to understand why a person is afraid if a bomb went off nearby, they got shot, something like that. It's much different to hear about the much more graphic experiences of what I personally did, what I personally witnessed, what I wanted to but could not stop, things like that. And so there was compounding effects interfering with the treatment of moral injury. And chaplains jumped in and said, no, this is right up our lane. We can handle this half of it. You handle the PTSD half of it. And as long as that partnership is made and respected, and you refer people back and forth, it works beautifully.
So that's an excellent explanation for me as a layperson, and I think I have an understanding of the field on which we're talking now, and how this could come about. Thanks for that. Something that often comes up in our discussions with Randy and I is he spent his 30 years as you did in the military, and I spent my time in the corporate environment. And for many practices that I see the military following, I can say, oh, there's an analog in the business world. And there's much more in common than we thought. This area, not so much, really not so much. But there is something that comes to mind, and I don't know if it's appropriate or you can speak to it, but when I would deal with problems and problems that went across the company. So I'm working on a compliance issue or a contracting issue or whatever it was, you would see symptoms that would be downstream. And I'm like, aha, I see something happening here and I see that it's causing a problem for us. Very often I would try to go and see if I could get to the root cause of it and say, I'd like this problem to happen less. I can treat the symptoms and I can do that, but it's much less efficient than figuring out why it's happening and stopping it. Now, I get that the problems you're describing are perhaps not so easy to eradicate, but now that I'm thinking back to what I've heard about problems with PTSD, and I hadn't heard of moral injury before today, it's almost always it happens. How do we treat it? Do you guys know if there must be measures in place to reduce the incidence of PTSD and moral injury on the moral side, right? If people have questions about what they're doing and whether it's right or not, can you help them work through that at the time that they're faced with those questions? So anyway, more broadly, the question would be, how much goes into the prevention right up front? Does the military take the lessons from what you guys are doing on the back end now, which is it's a very hard thing to do to heal an injury once it's been created. Anyway, so that's my question that occurred to me as I heard you talking.
And it's an excellent question because I think everybody grows up at least being exposed to, if not using the idiom of ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The challenge for the environment, at least, is that a lot of the sources of the moral injury can't be prevented. Now, and then there's debate over, can you have almost an inoculation, which, okay, the source is going to happen, but I'll be, for lack of a better word, immune from the outcome. And there are people who believe yes, and they'll provide various frameworks of thinking about the question supposedly would work prophylactically. But my personal take on it is you may help mitigate, but you can't eliminate. And I say that because as a person of faith, as a person specifically of Christian faith, we're created without the problems of the world, right? You look at the human origin story, Garden of Eden, we're created without violence, we're created without death, we're created without all of these elements. And that is the ideal. That is what the human soul longs for, is that tranquil, Edenic life. But the reality is we work and live in the world that isn't like that. Of course, the biblical origin story is Adam and Eve's rebellion, their willful entry into sin. Whether you take that or not, we can all look around the world and say it isn't all that it ought to be. Regardless of the cause, we can all agree on that point. And if we just say how we're raised, the vast majority of human beings are raised not to hurt one another, play nice with others, right? So you spend 18 years basically having a social construct. If you don't have the faith side of it, you at least have societal construct that says you don't hurt each other. You, in general, work for the benefit of the group as a whole. We all have our personal preservation interests involved in that. We work for the group as a whole. And then suddenly you're at 18, 19, 20 years old. You go through 8 or 9 weeks of basic combat training and onto your advanced individual training. So however many weeks of learning how to be an infantryman, an artilleryman, a tanker, or one of the many other jobs that are available. But you've got, we'll say, maybe 6 months worth of 18 years told you not to hurt other people, but we've just convinced you that it's okay to kill people if we say it's okay, right? That's far from a balance. I'm not saying that, and make it clear to anybody who's listening, I'm not saying that when a war is necessary that you just reject it because of what the personal level outcomes are. There are occasions where there is no other choice. That's the whole point of just war theory, decision-making, determining legal authorities, and all that kind of stuff. I'm only talking about what it does at the personal level. That individual soldier who grew up one way, had an intense but very brief amount of preparation, and then is called to do something that's well beyond the expectations of any person when they're growing up, and how that affects them emotionally. I will refer to it openly as a wound to the soul, in that it affects the very fiber of who you are. And so, how do you prevent a moral injury from occurring when, if the person goes to war, the following actions are going to happen? They are going to be involved in going out on patrols, being involved in firefights, artillery firing counter battery, all of these things that they were trying to hurt us, and we're going to hurt them first so that we don't get hurt. It's just, it is the system, right? There's not an adequate way to just make a person immune from the emotional changes that result from that. And as Randy mentioned a little while ago, now you've got leaders, right? Which have a much more complicated, that's the very simple case, just Joe on the ground with a rifle. You get a team leader, a squad leader, a platoon leader, company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander. Each of them, at each additional level, they are taking on the responsibility of every service member that serves under their command and under their direction. So how could I have stopped this soldier from doing this action? I ordered X into Y and Z resulted, and I don't like Z. So therefore, I'm responsible for what Y did. When, how many layers removed are you from that actual direct action? And yet there's a natural tendency. Good leaders take responsibility, take a sense of responsibility for their people. And under positive circumstances, that makes incredible cohesion. It makes a great command climate. It has service members that are proud of their service and what they do. But when bad things happen, it creates this exponentially harsh emotional response being pressured upon that leader.
I'd like to add something to what Steve said, James. I agree with everything he said. Obviously, there's just things you can't anticipate, especially in combat zones, that you keep. But the military has done so many studies now on PTSD and moral injury, less long, obviously, though it existed, obviously, from Vietnam to back in the days. You can talk to veterans about now, the ones that are still alive, and what they're talking about is moral injury a lot of times, about what they could have done to save their buddy or something like that. I think, in a way, though, if you ask Joe, they're done with the post-mission debriefs and all the chaplain talking to everyone before they go home, and the psychologist and the briefings you'll get before you get off the plane, before you get on the plane to go home. After you get off the plane, you'll have all these briefs. Nowadays, not necessarily when 9/11 hit, not necessarily 5 years after 9/11, but probably starting around 8 to 10 years after 9/11, they started realizing that we can't necessarily prevent this from happening, but we can maybe mitigate the effects. We can make more people aware of it. We can make it more acceptable that you're trying to get help for it, because that was a stigma for a long time, especially in like special operations, where, hey, if you're going to see a counselor about something, maybe you don't go on the next deployment. Maybe you don't belong in special forces anymore, or SEALs, or because you're not ready to do combat anymore with other people, because you're not all there. You're not mentally prepared. So that stigma has lessened, I think, to a point. And there's something to be said about a happy medium of, if you're in this zone, this moral injury zone, and it's affecting your work, and people can recognize that, then maybe that's not the right guy to lead the troops the next time until he gets better. And in some cases, maybe he's never going to be the right person ever again, because what some of the behavioral counselors and things are saying is, hey, if you go back, it's going to get this, you're going to go back the same way and get worse because of all these experiences you had. So there's all of that. Also, the problem with sending people back who have PTSD or moral injury is they lose in a way, sometimes they lose their humanity, their emotion. And when they go back and lead troops into combat again, And the new troops who they're leading, because they're leaders now, start freaking out over killing someone, over what's going on in the combat there. They don't empathize with those people. They're like, hey, suck it up and drive on, as opposed to when 9/11 first started, everyone was experiencing it for the first time together. The leaders, the team leaders, squad leaders, the Joe, and it was a lot more of a, in my opinion, because I went through both pieces of it, it was a lot more sharing environment where we're like, all right, we're going to get through this together. Yeah, that's our buddy, but we got to do the mission, and then we'll do what's right for our buddy and things like that. And then as the war went on, a lot of leaders became a lot colder and, hey, get your ass out there. And in certain situations, that's required. But even when there's a lull in fire, it's like, what are you doing? Quit whining, and let's, instead of being a little bit empathetic or giving them a little bit more kind of support and then moving on with the mission. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm just trying to relate it to my experiences there, James, but.
Yeah, let me add to that, Randy. You talked about going back to and pointed out Vietnam. And when Shea first started writing, he was talking about the Vietnam experience. But you can actually find moral injury in Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. You've got, and I don't remember which it is, but Achilles at one point, and of course I got to paraphrase, but he basically says, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of killing people. I don't care if I'm dishonored. I just want to go home and farm. And I mean, you read it and you're like, yeah, it's moral injury. I would rather be dishonored than do everything that I'm supposed to do. I'm tired of killing. I'm going to go farm. I'm going to bring things to life instead of bring things to death. And you see this teeter-totter going on, this emotional teeter-totter going on in the thinking and the emotions of Achilles, which now that we understand, or at least have a better understanding of moral injury, you can look at that and go, oh yeah, that is a story of moral injury right there. And that's that one short scene.
Go ahead, James.
No, I was going to maybe segue a little bit to keep things moving. I wanted to go back for a moment to something that I heard Steve say before and see if that helps us. And it is, what is a pilgrimage? I read about them in the Middle Ages, and I used to think it's something that was popular and didn't know that it was necessarily going on. Does it relate to what you were referring to before about the fact that the world we live in is flawed and difficult and problematic, and we strive as humans to get back to a simpler time? Or what does a pilgrimage mean to different people and to you? How do you understand it?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm going to give a kind of a multi-layered answer. And the first one is that, and it in some circles, it'll be an unpopular answer, but that's okay, because pilgrimage has really, people have blown not just the doors off, but removed the walls and roof and everything else. And it's emotional, or not emotional, it's a definition free for all in a lot of circles. But if you look historically from biblical patterns, the Hebrew people, from non-Christian, non-Jewish traditions of faith groups, to those that are pilgrimages for other reasons. And we can touch on that for a second. The pilgrimage follows a pattern, part one. There's a place that you are and a place that you're going. So you've got place, you got process, you do something, you go through something in order to achieve a purpose. So place, process, and purpose. There was a couple sociologists, anthropologists, actually a couple, I don't know if they met in their studies or whatever, but Victor and Edith Turner, and they wrote an excellent book on pilgrimage. Of course, they did one on ritual, and then they followed that up with a work on pilgrimage, showing that pilgrimage is a ritual. And what are rituals? Rituals are transformative events. And so, using some technical language of liminality, there's limin. You cross the limin, just means threshold, into a transformative period, which is, like, using the anthropology, sociology language, is liminality. But when it's done intentionally, when it's done by willing choice, it's referred to as liminoid. So a pilgrim crosses the limin into the liminoid, that I chose to do this transformation, and for the sake of achieving some kind of purpose. And that purpose is going to be dictated by the type of pilgrimage that you're on. All right. So that's the pattern of pilgrimage. The purpose, whatever the purpose is, that it's going to create some sort of change within you, some kind of transformation within you. Year before last, I was at the International Pilgrimage Symposium at William and Mary, and there was two presenters. I don't remember where they were professors at, but they presented a talk on food pilgrimage. And so this is why I say pilgrimage can be under a whole lot of different contexts, not just from a faith perspective. And they said, people talk about food tourism. We're not here for food tourism. A food tourist goes to experience food and go back home having that good experience. A food pilgrim goes to be transformed by the food they experience. And then they talked about people who were going to places like Thailand and hanging out in Buddhist monasteries and learning how the whole process of raising the garden and harvesting the food and how everything is done there, so that the food actually becomes a part of how they're thinking and believing about their consumption. So it's a transformative experience. That's just one example that they gave. Pilgrimage requires transformation. If you're a tourist, there's a lot of tourists that are on what are referred to as pilgrimages. They're just there to see. They're going to take some pictures. They're going to buy some souvenirs. They're going to go home and they're going to tell people what a great time they've had. And that's amazing. That's great. I've got no problem with what are frequently pejoratively referred to as peregrinos when you're on the Camino de Santiago. They're just there to see the stuff. But a person who enters in with a pilgrim's attitude is saying, I've left behind everything that's comfortable. I've left behind my house. I've left behind what I know. I've intentionally gone into this liminoid. I've intentionally gone into this process of transformation where I don't get to control things, so that by the time I get to where I'm going, I will have achieved my purpose of transformation has occurred, right? And what your purpose is, what type of transformation you're trying to experience is going to vary from person to person. West Point, and Randy Shirley has done at least one or two of these over the course of his career. The Army loves what's called a staff ride. They bring senior leaders out to the scenes of battles, and they get you out there and they walk you through, this happened here, and this happened here, and this happened here, with the intent that you mentally, emotionally put yourself in the scene. It happened to me a couple of years ago. I went to Little Bighorn. Now, I didn't intend to do it this way, but I went to Little Bighorn just to see it. My family grew up in the area, and I had been there before, but I'd never been there after having been in the Army. So I get there and I look, and if you know anything about North Dakota, North Dakota to Eastern Montana, it's extremely flat. They say you can see a man riding towards you 3 days before he gets to you. It's flat, right? And so I never could figure out how Custer could just move his entire regiment into such a lopsided ambush. But I had never paid attention to terrain when I was a kid. It was just a Little Bighorn and we ran around and just thought it was cool. But now going there, having gone through the training that the Army provided me when I was enlisted, gone to Iraq and recognized the importance of terrain features as they impact and contour the flow of battle, I looked around and said, it happens to be one of the few areas of Eastern Montana that has a lot of flowing hills. There's a lot of undulating ground there. And you could hide thousands of men out here. It is easy to see how those different native nations came together, worked, and put so many warriors in those little draws and valleys. And Custer rolled up on something that he had no clue that he was so vastly outnumbered. And I'm looking around and I'm feeling intimidated as I look and I scan the terrain, because in my mind, I was suddenly there, right? That was a transformative experience for me. So I just went out to look at it. I went to be a tourist, but in that little emotional switch that happened inside that I wasn't even cognizant of while it was happening, I suddenly became a pilgrim. And that's what West Point, when they're taking all these cadets to that battlefield, they literally go to the West Point website and look at student opportunities for staff rides. And the staff rides are referred to as pilgrimages. They want those cadets to be transformed, right? So transformation is the key element.
So you're getting at something that I was wondering about, and that is how important are the three different elements? Would you put any one higher than the other? I thought when you started, you were going to say, look, the purpose is important. If you go into this without a purpose, then you're not going to have the transformative experience. But you just gave me the impression that the combination of place and process all by itself could lead one to have a transformative event, even if they hadn't had that intention. But in your experience, I guess you could have any kind of combination of the three. Is it the place that is what is super important? Is it giving up control through the process? Or does it really work best if you come into it with a purpose first? What's been your experience now having accompanied people in your nonprofit? And we want to, of course, hear more details about that. But can you say anything at a high level about of the three? Does one really drive the boat?
Yeah, place is extremely important, and the process is extremely important. The purpose may be designated in advance and may occur as you're going, and it may change with or without your cooperation. And so the place is important. You have to be where you can't control things. So that leads directly into the process. And so why do people go away to a retreat, right? Because if you think you're 5 minutes away from home and you suddenly remember something that you ought to be doing, you're like, I'm just going to leave for a minute. No, you just broke the cycle. You're done. So place is important. The place should be significant to what you believe you're trying to accomplish. Even if what you're trying to accomplish ends up being modified during the process, the place that you leave, you're leaving so that you can enter the liminoid, right? So you're leaving a place and you're going to a different place. So place is a two-part. You have to leave the place that you're from. You have to be far enough away that it no longer can grab you, which becomes more and more difficult as data coverage increases and you can always be connected electronically. So I recommend to pilgrims all the time, turn your phone off at least until the end of the day. At least experience each day with complete separation. Besides, the people who are back home are still asleep when you're having all your experiences. So if you send them this really cool thing just happened at noon, they're going to be mad that you woke them up at 2 a.m. So just turn it off and leave it off until the end of the day. So you got to leave the place. You got to be far enough away that it's no longer drawing your attention. And the place that you are going, whether it's a destination pilgrimage, a place like Lourdes, for example, a destination pilgrimage, Assisi, Italy, destination pilgrimage, or the place that's a journey pilgrimage, like the Camino de Santiago, which is what I specialize in. It has to have some kind of significance that relates to what you believe your purpose is. Again, your purpose may change, it may modify along the way, but you have to it has to at least put you in that mindset. And then your process, when you interrupt it, you stop being a pilgrim, right? A friend of mine recently described it as people think that, a worm caterpillar wraps itself up in a cocoon and it slowly converts from caterpillar to butterfly. So if you were to cut the cocoon open halfway through the transformation process, you would see half caterpillar, half butterfly. But that's not the case. You cut a cocoon open mid-process and you see this completely third-party different. It's no longer caterpillar. It's something that's in between. It's just different. It's not the one. It's not what it was. It's not what it's going to be. And you have to embrace that. You have to embrace that I haven't gotten where I'm going. I am where I am. And that means allowing for the unknown. So our pilgrims come in and some have amazing success. And we can talk about that in a minute. Some of them have just absolutely amazing success. We've never had a person that was completely unsuccessful. People always make at least some progress. But we've had people who've had limited success. And the limited success is the person who can't allow themselves to be in that liminoid state, to be in that state of unknown. They have to wrest control. And so we're going along, and as leaders of the pilgrimage, myself, whichever psych doc is with us, and Jim Stinson, great guy, former Marine, he's our logistician. We know every step we're going to take that day. We know where we're going to eat. We know where we're going to sleep. We know everything. The point is for the pilgrims to trust us instead of trust themselves. And inevitably, there's going to be at least one or two that they can't allow themselves to trust. And so they start diverting their attention. Instead of believing that we will indeed stop for lunch, they run into a cafe and they buy themselves lunch, right? They start buying the experience that they want instead of trusting the experience to do what they want. And the moment they do that, you stop being a pilgrim and you start being a tourist because you've taken control. And you're gonna buy the experience that you want instead of trust the experience to give you the ultimate end, that purpose that you want.
So giving up control, I imagine, it is uncomfortable, right? Psychologically, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, which is the hard truth, right? Because it has to be done and yet you don't want to.
How much of the experience to be successful requires not just the giving up of control, which I understand your explanation of why that's important, but is it actually be putting yourself into an uncomfortable position? Is that why some pilgrimages, as I understood, were physically challenging? You had to walk 5,000 miles or do it on your hands and knees or not eat or different ways people made those pilgrimages, the journeys and the process uncomfortable. I can see we're partly about giving up control, but was there an element of suffering involved or is that reading too much into it?
No, actually, it doesn't. It does not have to include suffering. And I'll give a perfect example. Last year was the first year we had an international service member on our trip. We get international applications almost every year. For one reason or another, they've always previously not come about for one reason or another. But last year we had a Royal Marine Commando from the UK. And talk about a person who's physically fit, just amazing physical capability. And there was nothing we could do to challenge him, no matter how fast we walked. There's just nothing that we could have done to make his life uncomfortable. But he made a point of saying upon arrival, my task is to, they don't call them Joes in the UK. I can't remember what he said, but in US Army language, like my job is to be a Joe. You tell me where I need to be and you tell me what I need to wear and you tell me what to do. And I will just respond as you tell me. And he released, absolute release control of everything. And this is a person nearing his retirement after a long and really successful career as a Marine Commando. So he's used to being in charge. He's used to be charged in a very high octane command environment. And he was able to put himself in that pilgrimage mindset of, I'm here to let the pilgrimage work on me. And that means you tell me what's going on. He was never physically uncomfortable, but he had the most amazing formative experience. Remains in contact with me. I've got a pilgrimage scheduled different than for my own organization. I'm going to go help support another organization in Lourdes in May. And he's going to be as part of a much larger, Lourdes every year has an international pilgrimage that brings in service members from 40 different countries. And there will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 soldiers converge on the city of Lourdes in the month of May. So he'll be coming. We've already scheduled and planned for our meeting up in Lourdes. But there was no physical discomfort for him. It was strictly that having the attitude of, I don't have to be in charge. And if I am in charge, I won't gain the benefit that I'm here to gain. And he was strict. He was really disciplined with himself in holding back any desire to take leadership, which would have been natural for him. It would have been absolutely natural for him to do, but he was incredibly disciplined, really impressive how well he was able to say, nope, I'm just here to be Joe. And the impact was huge.
So let me ask you about that. You've said that some people have limited success, others have great success, and you referred to it in the context of this transformation. But what is actually the success that you would look to, that individuals look to say, I had a successful transformation? What are we talking about in
Okay.
terms of the
What is this, the Camino de Santiago? And
Sure.
went into it and then devolve into that, answering that question, Steve?
Okay. Yeah. All right. So we'll start with Camino de Santiago then and jump in if I get myself distracted, because I can talk about the Camino for the rest of the year and not be done yet. So the Camino de Santiago is the third oldest pilgrimage route in Christianity. First is the Holy Land, second is Rome, and third is Camino de Santiago. Santiago is Spanish for St. James. And it is believed, and I agree. I mean, there's reason to contest the belief, but I think I think the history of the church is accurate in this case, believe that James went on his missionary journeys. All the different apostles went on missionary journeys. That James went to Spain, the Iberian Peninsula at the time, as Spain wasn't a unified country. But then when he returned to Jerusalem, and there's a story behind that. He was executed in Jerusalem. And then the two people he was capable of converting, his missionary journey in Spain is reported to have been almost absolute failure. But he did convert at least a couple of people to Christianity. Those two converts brought the body back to Spain. And there's some miracle stories that go with that. But bottom line is they brought the remains back to Spain and ultimately buried him on a hill, which is now Santiago de Compostela. And I'll believe that you personality, what's his name? Was Ryan Ruins Everything or something? What's his name? Somebody ruins everything. Anyway, he tells you the truth behind the myth. Compostela does not mean field of stars. It means little graveyard. Compostium is Latin for the arranged internment. From that, we get composition, we get compost, we get all kinds of words in English, but it means arranged in internment. So graves, graveyard, intentional graveyard. And Ella is the diminutive suffix. And so you drop the UN off of compostium and you add the Ella and you have Compostela, right? St. James of the Little Graveyard. Now, that really is horrible as an origin story. It's a lot cooler to say Field of Stars. And at the time of the discovery, magical lights in the sky, angels singing, both of those were associated with a lot of miraculous discoveries. And at the same time, grave sites were coming to the forefront of being sacred locations for pilgrimage. So the fact that people blurred the lines and ignored the rules of Latin grammar and changed it over, it's understandable, because why do you want your city called graveyard when you could call it Field of Stars, right? Makes sense. It's not true, but it sounds awesome.
Marketing.
Yeah, exactly. People start making pilgrims. That was in latter 800s, the discovery of the remains. And so people start making pilgrimage. And it grew in popularity because during the Reformation, a lot of national borders were closed. People couldn't go to Italy. People couldn't go to the Holy Land, as countries were either declaring themselves Catholic or they were declaring themselves Protestant. So you had what were previously non-enforced borders suddenly becoming closed borders. People looked for local alternatives. So Compostela just exploded with popularity, and people started going to the grave of St. James, upon which the cathedral is built. And anybody who wants to doubt this, the little graveyard, all you got to do is go to the cathedral museum and they'll show you the graveyard that's underneath the cathedral, because the cathedral was built directly over the little graveyard. People started going, and it remained popular. Interest would peak for a little while, would drop for a little while, peak for a little while, drop for a little while. But there are people who wrote, whether their own pilgrim memoirs or formal intentional books about the Camino. It was never completely abandoned. And it's just had its more popular times and its less popular times. Since the dawn of the 1900s, there's been a concerted effort to increase the popularity of the Camino. And so you have books that were written in like 1910, 1920. The Highway to Santiago is one of them. Old book, the Route to Santiago. A couple of these early 20th century books talk about the pilgrims en route to Santiago. So you get this slow increase from then. Franco, who is looking to increase. People have stopped making movies in Spain, the good, bad, the ugly, and all that. All of the so-called spaghetti westerns that were actually filmed in Spain, not Italy. Those are bringing interest to Spain. Franco wants to really capitalize on that. So he finds out about the idea, not finds out like it was some big mystery, but he starts really capitalizing on the idea that a holy year was going to happen, which is the Feast of St. James. July 25th was going to fall on a Sunday in the year 1965. So he got everybody involved in tourism, public affairs, public relations, to just do this massive campaign, massive publicity campaign of maximizing that holy year. Michener wrote about it in his book on the Iberian Peninsula, and boom, people started talking about the Camino. Paul does the Camino. He writes his book, Pilgrim. Shirley MacLaine, motivated by makes the pilgrimage. She writes her book about it. Both of those are secular writers. So now you've moved the pilgrimage from being a distinctly Christian with strong Catholic overtones to a secular, like secular people can do this too. And the two converge, and it's just been exponentially growing in popularity ever since, to the point where last year they broke a record, even only a couple of years coming out of COVID, which most of the world is recovering quickly, but much more slowly than that. They not only came back up to what they were accomplishing pre-COVID, they broke all previous records of over 300,000 pilgrims in a single year. Now, during the winter, the numbers drop off completely. So that means in the summertime, they were having 2,000 to 3,000 pilgrims a day show up in Santiago de Compostela, registering at the pilgrim office, having completed the pilgrimage. The Camino de Santiago is a little bit of a misnomer in that it's not a single route, it's a network of routes, because back in the golden age of pilgrimage, people just either started at their own front door or they started at their parish church. So looking like any other roadmap, all of these different routes and ultimately converging at the city center, the old historic city center. So that is as short as I can personally make it from dawn to today. But today it's a network of routes primarily dominated by the Camino Francés, which if you look at the profile of the country, about 1/3 of the way down, running from east to west, from the French border across to the city of Santiago de Compostela. It takes you through the Meseta, which is a largely flat, not very well developed area, through Castilla y León and Lugo, which are lots of townships, lots of cities, into the beautiful area of Galicia, which is mountains and green eucalyptus groves that just smell amazing, to the great vineyards of the different Spanish wine companies, and then ultimately into the historic cathedral city.
Let me ask you a question. You referred to, and that's a great bit of history and current knowledge, a really nice introduction. I got more from that about the history than I did when you had explained it, Randy, which was more about your journey on the process. No, I don't mean it in a bad way, just there's quite a bit of information there. You referred to two types of pilgrimages before, Steve. You said there are destination pilgrimages and journey pilgrimages. And this is obviously a journey pilgrimage. You do end up at the cathedral, right? And other than getting your book stamped, is it anticlimactic? Or you're like, oh, I just spent a month walking and now it's done? Or is there something you do that also makes it feel like a destination pilgrimage, if you know what I mean?
And that does vary from person to person. For me, it was not anticlimactic. To me, my personal experience, my first pilgrimage was in 2016. I was on terminal leave from the Army. I had actually been asking to take leave to walk the Camino for many years, and it had always gotten turned down for one reason or another. One, it's a large chunk of leave. Two, I had overly cautious commanders that the S2, the intelligence people, would come in for overseas leave. You got to get their report on the country. And they'd always read something about Basque separatists rattling their sabers. And they're like, no, there's potential terrorist activity. I'm like, no, there's not. No, there's not. But for one reason or another, 5 different leave attempts always got turned down. So finally, I'm on terminal leave. I'm like, you can't turn me down now. I signed out. I'm done. And so I went during that time. But I went with very much, I'm a person of faith. I'm going to see St. James, this apostle of Jesus who walked with Jesus. And it was a journey pilgrimage. And there was a lot of transformation. And my purpose both remained steady in ultimately arriving in Santiago to see the relics of St. James, but also was transformed. The purpose itself was transformed in my own transformation process, because I want to see St. James, and I also want to know what I'm going to do when I get out of the Army. I've been in the Army since I was 17 years old, with that short break in the middle to go through seminary to get ordained and get back into the Army. I've got almost twice as much time in the Army as I've got out of the Army. What do I do next? I'm going to be floundering around again. And the journey process talked to that. The journey process was so amazing for me in getting a vision for what to do next, which ultimately was the birth of the charity, the 501c3, the veteran organization, Warriors on the Way. But then when I got to the cathedral, for me, it was the apex. It was the apex rather than anticlimactic, because I get down and I watched the one where Randy described his Camino experience. I don't remember if you talked about this or not, the actual going into the cathedral. You go into the cathedral and you get routed up this step of stairs that actually brings you over the altar. And over the altar, there's this giant silver-clad statue of St. James overlooking the congregation. And the tradition is to give the saint a hug. And then you go down the opposite side because you got a big, long line of people behind you. And when you go down the opposite side, it routes you into a door that brings you down and below the altar where the relics are located, where the relics of St. James are located. And so you get there, and again, I'm approaching it totally as a person of faith who believes that the history of his being there is legitimate. And I'm looking at this silver ossuary, fancy word for bone box, and I'm looking at it and think to myself, inside that silver box are the bones of a man who walked with Jesus 2,000 years, give or take a year or two ago. And it was just like this awe-inspiring moment, which took a moment. Like I had to sit and allow that to soak in, the magnitude of that to soak in. And in allowing the magnitude of that to soak in, I was thinking about getting off of the plane and finding my way to my start point and getting lost a couple times and who intervened to get me back on the track. The people that I met that we had positive interactions, the people that I met that had not as positive interactions, the people that I met along the way that asked me to pray for them, the people who saw me celebrating the mass in the morning and just walked over and asked to join me. And so as I'm just allowing the whole experience to come together with observing the relics of St. James, like I started the thought with that man walked with Jesus. And I ended, by the time I was ready to get up and step out of the way of the people who were not so patiently waiting for me to get out of their way, I walked away with Jesus walked with me all the way here. And so it was my apex experience. So that is one end of the spectrum. And the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a lot of people who show up and they want to continue in that journey. And they get to the cathedral and they say, I've known no other life other than getting up and walking every day for the last 20 days, 30 days, 35 days, 45 days. I met one person who had walked all the way from the toe of the boot of Italy, walking for 4 months, right? 80 years old. When I'm 80, I want to be him. He said he started walking on his 80th birthday, walked all the way up Italy, across the Alps, across Switzerland into France, across France, over the Pyrenees, across Spain. It took him 4 months to do it, but it was amazing. And now they knew they wanted to do the pilgrimage, but they didn't have a destination thought. They only had the journey thought, which is understandable. That's the way most people approach the Camino. But for them, there can definitely be some anticlimactic, I don't know what to do next. Some of them choose to walk out the rest of the way to the coast. Some stay in Santiago and explore. Some they're actually trying to discourage it now. And Randy, I'm sure you saw it. Some will like literally camp out in front of the cathedral. Like, I don't know what to do next, so I'm just going to sit here. And you go into the cathedral plaza in the middle of the night, you find all these people just sleeping there in front of the cathedral because we got here, but we don't know what to do next.
Probably can't find a place to live nowadays because 3,000 people came in every day.
Yeah, lodging is more difficult to find now than it was. And then people between my extreme on one end and I don't know what to do, so I'm going to literally camp in front of the cathedral. Between those two polar ends of the spectrum, there's varying levels of how that I hit the official end point impacts the person's emotional response. When I bring groups, and bring a group every year, bringing 2 groups this year actually, the guidance that we give is you've only started your pilgrimage. Your real pilgrimage is the remainder of your life. And you need to go home with all the principles that you've learned along the way, your new way of looking at possessions, your new way of looking at interacting with people, your new way of reflecting on your own life. And don't forget it just because you walk back in your own front door. use that as a guideline or a template for your future decisions and your future way of living so that this pilgrimage experience can continue. And because we specifically work with PTSD and moral injury response, with the intent of PTSD and moral injury response, I will quote and then I will paraphrase Jesus in John. He says it in other places, but John chapter 15 talks about it just over and over. Eight times in 8 verses, abide in me and I will abide in you. And so by the time they hit the end, and to bring this back to how this whole part started, what are the results? By the time we hit the end, people have made significant progress in the diminishment of their PTSD symptoms, moral injury symptoms. And so it's like, Jesus said, abide in me and I will abide in you. Likewise, you have to abide in your healing so that your healing abides in you. If you want this to have durability in your life, you want it to have ongoing effect, you have to continue to practice the principles that you learn on this pilgrimage.
So I'll just give you a little bit about my, like a 2-minute view of what I experienced. And then let's talk about Warriors on the Way. I didn't research this very well when I did it. I was like, up until I heard about it, I was like, I think I might hike the Appalachian Trail when I get out, because I don't know what I want to do with my life. And then one of the people that worked with me did it the year before I got out. And I said, wait a second, what's this thing? And so I bought a guide, which I didn't read the history of it or anything. I just said, okay, how do I get started? What do I got to bring? That's what I looked at. So I started it and I didn't look at it from a religious point of view. I walked it. I met people. I got to the end. I saw the cathedral. I didn't go in the cathedral. There was a long line. I'd been waiting in line for the last 30 days. I was like, and I had to wait a line. I already had to wait in line. James, I don't know if you know this. You get a signed document in Latin from the Catholic Church at the end. Is it the Catholic Church, Steve, that gives you that?
Cathedral office. So it's a big picture. It's from the church, but the functional answer is it's from that specific cathedral.
Okay. So but it's not actually in the cathedral, right? It's not, they don't want to.
Separate office, yeah. It's part of the cathedral complex, but it's a separate office, yeah.
So you got to wait in line all day there to get that, and then they put your name on it, and it's a scroll, and you can buy a box for it so it doesn't get destroyed on your way home. And so I got that, and that was like the last line I was really interested in waiting in. Also, Steve, I don't know if you know this. I did walk with my father. Who I turned 50. I think he was almost 75. And I went with my 50-year-old son, and we all walked the last 100 miles together. We all met up there. My dad he did the Madrid route. I don't know what that's called, but he started in Madrid and walked up. And then I started in the traditional French way. And then my son met us at what's that city that everyone started? What's that?
Sarria.
So he met us there, and we all walked the last 100 miles together. So my son was definitely done walking or waiting around by the time we got there too. So that was my experience. But I really want you to get into like why you started the Warriors on the Way and how people can get involved with it and go that direction.
We'd love to hear what you think. So please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.